On June 20th, 1942, a boy named Brian Wilson was born in Inglewood, California. Long before America called him a genius, he was simply a shy kid sitting beside a piano trying to escape the noise inside his own home. Decades later, millions of people would hear his music playing through car radios, beach speakers, old vinyl records, and summer memories that never truly faded away. To older Americans, Brian Wilson did not just create songs. He created an entire feeling. Warm sunshine, young love, endless highways. A version of America that seemed beautiful forever. But behind those harmonies was a man quietly falling apart. As the 1960s exploded around him, Brian Wilson became one of the most admired musicians in the world. Critics called him a genius. Fans treated him like a miracle. Even rival artists feared the level of emotion hidden inside his music. Yet while the world was celebrating the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson was beginning to disappear into isolation, paranoia, fear, and silence. There were years when he barely left his bedroom, years when people around him controlled his life, years when America watched him smile in public while privately wondering if he would survive at all. And perhaps the saddest part is this. The very music that made millions of people feel happy was often created by a man who could barely find peace himself. By the time Brian Wilson reached his early 20s, America already believed he had discovered the perfect sound of youth. Alongside his brothers, Dennis and Carl Wilson, cousin Mike Love, and friend Al Jardine Brian, helped transform the Beach Boys into one of the defining groups of the 1960s. Their music sounded effortless. California beaches, surfboards, fast cars, young romance, endless summers. To millions of Americans growing older now, those songs still feel like memories frozen in time. But the real Brian Wilson was nothing like the carefree image America saw on television. Friends often described him as painfully sensitive, quiet, nervous, and emotionally fragile. Behind closed doors, he carried deep scars from childhood, especially from his difficult relationship with his father, Murray Wilson. The pressure inside the Wilson household shaped Brian long before fame arrived. Music became the one place where he felt safe. At the piano, he could control emotion in ways he never could in real life. Then something extraordinary happened. Brian Wilson stopped thinking like a normal songwriter. He began hearing entire arrangements in his head before musicians even entered the studio. Harmonies became layered like emotions. Instruments sounded almost cinematic. Songs no longer felt simple. They felt personal, haunted, vulnerable, beautiful. By the middle of the 1960s, even groups like the Beatles were paying close attention to what Brian Wilson was creating in America. His legendary album, Pet Sounds, shocked the music industry. Many critics today still call it one of the greatest albums ever recorded. But while the world admired his brilliance, Brian himself was beginning to collapse under the weight of perfection. He became obsessed with creating sounds nobody had ever heard before. Studio sessions lasted endlessly. Anxiety followed him everywhere. The pressure to outdo himself slowly turned into emotional exhaustion. Then came panic attacks, isolation, and mental struggles that became impossible to hide. America still heard beautiful music. But Brian Wilson was already slipping away from the world around him. For many older Americans, the turning point in Brian Wilson's life did not happen on stage. It happened quietly inside recording studios, hotel rooms, and long nights where almost nobody truly understood how fragile he had become. In late 1964, Brian suffered a nervous breakdown while traveling with the Beach Boys. At only 22 years old, he suddenly realized he could no longer handle the pressure of constant touring, screaming fans, interviews, and endless expectations. Most people thought he was simply exhausted. The truth was much darker. Brian's mind was beginning to turn against him. After leaving the road, he focused entirely on songwriting and production. And for a brief moment, it seemed like genius had completely taken over. He created some of the most emotionally powerful music America had ever heard. Songs like God Only Knows and Wouldn't It Be Nice sounded soft and beautiful on the surface, but underneath them was loneliness, fear, and a desperate search for peace. Then came Smile. Brian Wilson believed Smile would become the greatest album of his career. Some people around him even believed it would change music forever. But the deeper Brian went into the project, the more unstable he became. Recording sessions grew strange and chaotic. Friends noticed paranoia, mood swings, fear. At times, Brian barely seemed connected to reality. While other rock stars of the 1960s were becoming symbols of rebellion and confidence, Brian Wilson was quietly collapsing under emotional pressure. Nobody around him knew how to stop. The worst part was that America still expected perfection from him. Fans wanted another masterpiece. Record executives wanted more hits. The music industry wanted the genius version of Brian Wilson every single day. But inside, he was exhausted, frightened, and mentally overwhelmed. By the time Smile finally collapsed, unfinished Brian Wilson had emotionally shattered along with it. And for many fans, watching from afar, it felt like America was slowly losing one of its brightest musical minds in real time. By the 1970s, Brian Wilson no longer looked like the young musical genius America remembered from magazine covers and television appearances. The smile was fading. The energy was gone. And behind the walls of his own home, Brian Wilson had started disappearing from public life almost completely. There were periods when he spent months inside bedrooms with curtains closed, barely speaking to people around him. Friends described seeing a man trapped inside his own mind. Some days, he would sit silently for hours. Other days, he seemed disconnected from reality altogether. Weight gain, depression, substance abuse, and emotional instability slowly transformed him into somebody many fans barely recognized. Yet somehow, the music never fully left him. Even during his darkest years, people close to Brian still believed the genius was hiding somewhere underneath the pain. Fellow musicians often spoke about him with a level of respect that almost sounded heartbreaking. To many artists, Brian Wilson was not just talented. He was one of the few people who genuinely changed the emotional possibilities of popular music forever. But admiration could not rescue him from isolation. As the years passed, Brian became increasingly dependent on people controlling different parts of his life. Perhaps the most controversial figure was psychologist Eugene Landy, whose influence over Brian eventually shocked the public. Landy did not simply act like a therapist. According to many critics and former associates, he became deeply involved in Brian's personal decisions, career, finances, and daily existence. To older Beach Boys fans, this era felt painful to witness. America remembered the man who once created the soundtrack of youth and freedom. Now they were watching someone who looked emotionally exhausted, fragile, and lost. Interviews often felt uncomfortable. Public appearances sometimes seemed forced. Many fans wondered if Brian Wilson would ever truly recover. And yet, something remarkable kept happening. Despite everything, audiences still loved him. Whenever Brian appeared at a concert or returned to music, people did not only see a celebrity, they saw survival. They saw a man who had somehow endured decades of mental struggles while carrying one of the most beautiful musical legacies in American history. But the emotional scars never fully disappeared. What makes the story of Brian Wilson so emotional for older Americans is not simply the tragedy. It is the feeling that an entire generation grew old alongside him. In the 1960s, Brian Wilson represented possibility. His music sounded hopeful, innocent, almost magical. For young Americans driving along the coast or hearing the Beach Boys on summer radio stations, life still felt open and endless. But as the decades passed, Brian's struggles became impossible to separate from the changing mood of America itself. The country changed, music changed, youth disappeared. And somehow Brian Wilson seemed to carry all of that sadness inside him. There were still moments of hope. In later years, Brian returned to the stage, completed Smile, decades after abandoning it, and received standing ovations from audiences who never stopped believing in him. Fans who once listened to him as teenagers were now elderly themselves, watching a man they loved survive battles most people could never fully understand. Those concerts often felt less like entertainment and more like emotional reunions. People were not simply applauding old songs. They were applauding endurance, survival, memory. A man who somehow kept moving forward despite carrying decades of emotional pain. And perhaps that is why Brian Wilson continues to matter so deeply today. Not because he was perfect. Not because he lived like a traditional rock star. But because millions of people saw something painfully human inside him. Behind the legendary harmonies and California Dreams was a frightened, sensitive man trying to hold himself together while the entire world called him a genius. And for many older fans, that truth makes his music feel even more beautiful now than it did 50 years ago. For decades, Brian Wilson gave America music that sounded brighter than real life itself. But behind those harmonies was a man quietly fighting battles most people never truly saw. While audiences remembered beaches, sunshine, and youth, Brian Wilson often lived inside fear, exhaustion, and emotional isolation. Yet somehow, his music survived everything. That may be the real reason older Americans still feel emotional when they hear songs from the Beach Boys today. Those records are no longer just about California dreams. They are reminders of time itself. Lost summers, young love, family road trips, old radios playing in the background while life still felt simple. And at the center of all those memories stands Brian Wilson. Fragile, brilliant, lonely, unforgettable. Even after decades of pain, silence, and personal struggle, America never fully stopped loving him. Because deep down, people understood something important. Brian Wilson was not simply creating music. He was trying to create peace for himself.